Well, thank you all
Thank
for
you.
having me. Um, yeah, so I've been working on whale evolution since I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan and continue to do so. So I'm just going to tell you a story that I and my colleagues have been putting together for, well, since before I was working on this, but really the big discoveries about early whale evolution, at least has happened in the last 25 or 30 years. So I'm just going to start at the beginning and tell you a little bit about modern whales. So modern whales are grouped into a group that we call the Neoceti, which is made of two groups, the Mysticeti, which are the big baleen whales, the ones that filter feed. And instead of teeth, they don't have any teeth. They have this structure called baleen, which is made out of keratin, the same stuff as your hair and fingernails. And they swim around the ocean and filter things out of the water using their baleen. Not nearly as diverse as the toothed whales or the Odontoceti, which include all the dolphins and porpoises and even the killer whale shown here. And the largest one is the sperm whale. So today there are many more of these than mysticetes. And in fact, they're more diverse at most times in the past than mysticetes as well. And instead of vision, most use echolocation to find prey. So they send out high frequency sounds, and then their ears can perceive the echoes of those high frequency sounds to locate things in their environment, including food. But both of these groups are derived from a stem whale group called the artiodacyls. And these are the animals that undergo the transition from land to sea. And we know a lot more about these than we used to. It's broken down into 5 different families. As of now, we have about 51 fossil genera. When I started, there's maybe 20. So we are learning more and more about these, and they're basically all from the Eocene, which is a time period when a lot of modern mammal groups got their first start. And if there's one thing to remember from today's lecture, it's what you already heard, is that whales are part of this group of terrestrial mammals called artiodactyls. And you see here in green are the artiodactyls, except the hippopotamus there, and Cartharia and Indohyus at the bottom are also artiodactyls, but they're closer to whales, which are blue. So they're semi-aquatic, perhaps, artiodactyls, plus the cetacea, which are semi-aquatic and fully aquatic cetaceans. And what unites all artiodactyls is they all have that little bone in the lower left-hand corner there. That's a bone called the astragalus, and all mammals have an astragalus. In fact, all amniotes have astragalus, but artiodactyls have one that have sort of a pulley shape on the proximal end, the one towards the body, and a little pulley shape on the other end. So we call it a double pulley astragalus. And what it does is it allows the foot and the limb to move really effectively in one direction, forward. Basically, they can run really fast forward. And so, wouldn't you know, whales today don't have hind limbs, but as we did genetic studies, we found that the genetic studies were suggesting that they were either sister taxa or relatives of artiodactyls, or when we got better genetic studies, it said, no, they're really within artiodactyls, and maybe even hippos are their closest relatives. And in fact, then we found the fossils which had fully developed hind legs on whales, and they had this double pulley astragalus. All of a sudden, paleontologists were like, okay, geneticists, you're right. They are artiodactyls. And in fact, hippos are their closest living relatives. Oh, I should tell you, the other thing that makes an artiodactyl an artiodactyl is they have an even number of toes. So they're the cloven hooved ungulates. They're not really one hoof split in two, they're two hooves merged into one. So the bones of the toes are fused together, ending in two split toes like that. So in the fossil record, we have this group of artiodactyls, and it says terrestrial with an asterisk because they're venturing into the water, and we have good evidence for that. This group called the Rawelidae are from India and Pakistan, and they look superficially, their skeleton, which is shown in the upper right, looks pretty terrestrial. There's nothing about it that particularly says, hey, I'm a whale, until you look at the base of the skull. And if you look in the upper right, there are these sort of balls of bone under there that are the auditory bullae. These are bones that cover the ears. And in whales, they are pachyosteosclerotic. And all that means is they're thick and they're dense. And only whales, only things in the water have ears that are pachyosteosclerotic. And these raw whalids have them, even though the rest of their skeleton looks pretty terrestrial. And if you look in the long bones in cross section, they also have a very thick wall, which is typical of things that are in the water for some reason. So in the lower left, you see my colleague Hans Davison has reconstructed Indohyus here being underwater. And you might ask yourself, well, why is Indohyus underwater? He suggested that perhaps it was because there are small things like mouse deer in Asia today that will go hide in the water when they're threatened by predators. And that maybe, but these guys are more habitually in water because the pachyosteosclerotic bulla suggests they were trying to hear sounds underwater, because that's what that's an adaptation for, is hearing underwater. So I think they were probably foraging underwater. Although their teeth look like those of terrestrial artiodactyls, we tend to think of artiodactyls as herbivores. You know, deer eat plants, right? And bison graze. But there are more omnivorous artiodactyls, like think pigs, right? Pigs will eat anything. And so I think these probably had an omnivorous diet and were simply starting to specialize on aquatic prey. So I'm going to tell you the story now of whale evolution proper in these three phases. First, we're going to talk about that transition from being on land or just starting to get in the water to being more fully aquatic, or as aquatic as modern whales. Then talk about the early diversification of the modern groups of whales. And finally, I'll wrap up with like how we get to today, basically the origin of modern families in general. So since this is, in the past, it's always really good to remind ourselves that the world of the Eocene did not look like the world of today. Although you could recognize continental landmasses pretty easily, the main differences are that North and South America were not connected. India was just starting to collide with Asia. Remember, it came from the south and hit Southern Asia, just beginning to sort of kiss Southern Asia. And Antarctica was still connected to both South America and Australia. And if you know anything about ocean currents today, you know that there's a circumantarctic current that just goes around and around Antarctica. It's kind of circular if you look at it from a southern polar view. And this current today keeps it isolated and cold because most solar radiation hits the equator and gets transferred by currents towards the poles. But it can't get to Antarctica because of this current that goes around and around and keeps it cold. In the Eocene, those currents could effectively get to the South Pole, or to at least the edge of Antarctica, because that current couldn't form because of these connections between Antarctica and South America. So the world was much more equable, which means the pole to equator temperature gradient was much shallower. And it was warmer, and there's no permanent ice on the planet. So in the summertime, every bit of snow that fell at the poles melted. No glaciers, maybe some alpine glaciers somewhere, but no ice sheets at either pole. And so the red arrows show that water could basically flow around, not exactly the equator, but the sort of center part of the globe, pretty effectively, because India hadn't collided with Asia. There's water where the Mediterranean is, and a water gap between North and South America. So a pretty different place, oceanographically speaking. And it's at this point in the late early Eocene where the first things that we call whales show up. And these are the pachycetids, again, from so named because it's from Pakistan. So it's the Pakistan whale, Pachycetus. And these two guys, Phil Gingrich, shown in the bottom there, has this reconstruction of Pachycetus swimming. Philip was my thesis advisor as a student and he was the thesis advisor of Hans Tavison, the other guy at the top too. Hans has it reconstructed walking. Now, they sort of argue in the literature about how terrestrial or how aquatic it was, but frankly, it could walk just fine, it could swim just fine. And in fact, those animals are really similar if you really look at them. It's just one is walking and one is swimming. So it's pretty effective at both. But it has some features which are more whale-like than the rowellids. So here's a part of the skull. The orbits are really high on the skull, really, really high. And it has a long snout. So here's the lower jaw. Excuse me, you can see the long snout here. So all whales, most aquatic vertebrates have a long snout because they use that snout kind of like a pincher, right? And they go, boop, and they can grab onto aquatic prey like that. And the teeth are quite different from those of rowellids. The premolars, these ones, can you see my pointer or not?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. It came back. I don't know what was going on. So these 4 teeth are the premolars, and you can see they're sort of triangular shaped. And those look more like later whales than they do like rowellids. And these are the molars back here, and they're starting to take on a different, pretty different shape from the rowellids and more like those of later whales. And we have the skull, and it too has a pachyosteosclerotic auditory bulla, which suggests that it's spending time in the water, again, probably to feed. And then a few million years later, we have this animal, Ambulocetus, and it's Ambulocetus natans is its full name, and it means the walking whale that swims. So just the name emphasizes the interpretation that this was a whale that could very effectively move from land to sea. Again, long snout, triangular teeth. The ones in front, the incisors are very pointy and they're good at acquiring prey. And this too is from Pakistan. And so just a little bit, I think it's sort of jumping ahead a couple million years every time we do this. And just know that I'm skipping a lot of stuff because remember, there's a lot of diversity going on here. I'm just giving you sort of the highlights along the way to get to modern whales. So now you start to see stuff outside of Indo-Pakistan. We still have whales there. We start to see them in Egypt, West Africa, Europe, North America, even Western Peru, and down here in New Zealand. We have them basically all over the world by the Middle Eocene. Although the oceanographic situation is basically the same. We still have these connections, so still warm, still equable, and the pathways to get from these places are all about the same. And it's during the Middle Eocene that the protocetids come to shine, and this is the group that has the most diversity, and the ones that really encompass that transition from living on land to living in sea. So Rhodocetus here's the skeleton. We have most of it, basically missing the distal end of the tail, but we have representatives of the bones of the rest of the body. Pretty good hind legs, so still capable of terrestrial locomotion, but also very effective at swimming. And the sort of best analogy to a modern creature is probably think sea lion, right? They're very effective swimmers, and they still locomote quite effectively on land. And here are some pieces of Rhodocetus. So here's the skull and lower jaw, just some highlights. Again, here's the nares. This is the nose hole. And notice that as we go through evolution, that's going to move farther and farther and farther back on the skull. Also, this is the jaw. We're looking at the inside of the jaw, not the outside. We're looking inside. In most mammals, on the inside, there's a little hole where blood vessels and nerves go into the jaw to feed the teeth, right? Your teeth have nerves and blood vessels in them. There's this massive hole here. And we find that in all modern cetaceans, and it shows up early in whale evolution. And what happens is that in modern whales, there's a big pad of fat that sits in there. And if you put a big pad of fat here, what's it right next to? Anybody? Like what other structures are right next to?
Your ears?
Right next to your ears, that's right. And it's acoustic fat. And so whales kind of hear through this fat pad, like the sound comes in their jaw and transmits through that fat pad to the ears. And we see that really early on in whale evolution. Very interesting. Here's the pelvis and femur. So the femur is kind of stout, it's a little short, but it's strong. Here's the hand and here's the foot. And this is what the hand, both hands and both feet looked like when they pulled it out of the field and brought it back for prep. And here's what they look like when they're done. And this is the key to understanding that they are artiodactyls. This bone right here is the astragalus, and it's got that double pulley shape, pulley, pulley. Really distinctive, clearly have it here in early whales. So protocetids undergo a bunch of changes, but these are the highlights. Again, they have these really tall thoracic spines on their thoracic vertebrae, so the ones in the chest, and a limited number of them. There's like 12. There's maybe 6 lumbar vertebrae, and their sacrum undergoes through their evolution a disconnection. So sacral vertebrae are those that hold up the pelvis, and typically artiodactyls have 3 vertebrae that are fused together that hold the pelvis. These guys add a 4th, then they start taking away. They go 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, because they get more aquatic, and eventually the hind limb actually detaches from the vertebral column, which makes it useless for walking on land. Because if your hips weren't attached to your backbone, they wouldn't do you much good walking on land. These guys also have a, yeah, go ahead.
The question mark in the chat. What did the proto whale eat?
We don't know for sure, but almost certainly fish and squid, because that's basically what every marine mammal eats nowadays, unless you're an herbivore, right? So if you're carnivore, fish and squid are it. There's one exception to that. I don't know if I have a slide, but you can ask me at the end if I forget to tell you the one exception to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So here is an interpretation of one of these animals related to Rhodocetus called Myocetus. And again, so it has a sort of sea lion-like habit. And the one thing that, if you think about pinnipeds today, the seals, sea lions, and walruses, the one thing they all still do is breed and have their babies. Well, they don't all have their babies on land, but often they do. And so reproduction seems to be one of those things that's the last to transition. And I never thought we'd have data to address whether a whale like this was having their babies on land or in the water, but there's a really interesting observation that got made. So if you think about, you've seen those nature videos with the antelope having their babies on this in the Serengeti, right? What end comes out first, the head or the tail? It's the head, right? So the baby's head pops out and the legs come out and they get up and jump around really fast, right? So artiodactyls, all of them, head first birth. But whales do it tail first, because if the head came out first, the baby could drown. If it gets stuck at all, it could drown. You know, if it started to take a breath underwater, it would drown. So whales come out tail first, and then mom immediately gets under them and pushes them up to the surface. So Phil Gingrich, my former advisor, found a skeleton of this animal that was a very pregnant female, like ready to give birth. And the baby was positioned to come out head first. And that suggests that they're probably still being born on land. Because again, if they came out head first, they might drown. So this is the mother whale, Myocetus, and this is a reconstruction of mom just having had her little baby on land. Okay, so at the very end of the Eocene, again, this is sort of the last time I'm going to show you this lovely equable tropical world. And we have whales everywhere, but notice they're all now this yellow dot, which is the family Basilosauridae. We got them. We actually have them in Indo-Pakistan too, Egypt, Europe, West Africa, North America, Peru, New Zealand, even Antarctica's got some. So this last group of archaeocetes, the Basilosaurids, are globally distributed. And this is an example of one of these called Dorodon. This is the animal that I did my doctoral dissertation on. We have a reconstruction of the skeleton. It should look pretty different from the protocetids I just showed you. It has more thoracic vertebrae. There's 17 or more, 20 lumbar vertebrae. And that, my friends, is the hind limb that has now really shrunk and detached from the vertebral column. So absolutely no use in terrestrial locomotion. The forelimb is definitely flipper shaped, and the scapula is much broader because virtually all the muscles that move the forelimb are attached to the scapula, and the nares is even further back on the skull here, and a couple other things which I'll show you in a minute. So here's the skull in dorsal, ventral, and lateral views. So here's the nares farther back. They've lost an upper tooth. The last upper molar is gone. And all these triangular teeth, which we first saw in Pakicetus, now have these little accessory denticles on them, these extra bumps. We're not 100% sure what they're for. The hypothesis out there is they're probably used to help grip food, because these animals still chewed their food. They actually still would bite, and these triangles, see this triangle would fit up here? They would slice the food, and then you have to eat the pieces. But if you do that in the water, the piece out here might fall away, right? So it's kind of dangerous, but we think this might be to help grip the food, and we're going to start doing some tests to figure out whether that's true or not. Every whale today does not chew. They just swallow their food whole. Even toothed whales don't chew the fruit. And you can see there's these weird, see these ovals here? These are actually pits in the palate where these teeth actually kind of poke in. So they really fit together very carefully. And they, of course, retain this pachyosteosclerotic bulla, but add some spaces around it that are filled with probably air and sort of foamy tissue, which helps isolate the ear from the skull, which helps them hear better directionally underwater, so they can hear where the sound is coming from. Here's some more stuff about Dorodon. We have so much of this animal, mostly from Egypt, that died at different ages. So we have a lot of juveniles all the way up to very senescent, very old adults. And this is my favorite specimen down here. It shows, this is the maxilla. It's this bone right here. And these three teeth are baby teeth. This is baby premolar 2, 3, and 4. That is the first molar is just starting to come in. And this little guy here is the last baby tooth to come in. So it's deciduous premolar 1 just coming in there. And from a whole bunch of them that died at different stages, we can work out up here that the sequence in which all the teeth erupted, which suggests that they grew up slowly compared to other mammals at the time. And there's other hints in the skeleton that suggest that too, because a lot of the sutures, the places where two bones meet, don't fuse until really late in life for these guys. So they probably come sexually mature long before they are skeletally mature, which is true of whales today. Like even adult whales, like a lot of their bone sutures are open. They kind of really delay maturation, which is unusual and interesting. These are the little ear ossicles, the little bones that connect your eardrum to the cochlea where sound perception takes place. These are all very dense, again, to help match the energy of sound in water. And this is the cochlea, the bone in which sound energy is turned into nervous impulses that go into the brain. And that's how you hear. And by looking at it, you can look at the very fine anatomy of these things and tell that these guys could hear like modern baleen whales. So the ones that hear lower frequency sounds, and they could not perceive high frequency sound, which suggests they could not echolocate like modern toothed whales did. So these guys have the sort of standard lower frequency hearing, not the highly adapted high frequency hearing of modern toothed whales. This is the end of the tail of Dorodon compared to that of a Stenella, which is a modern spinner or spotted dolphin. And if you look at Stenella, you see that these vertebrae get narrower and narrower and narrower, and then they get really flat, but they get broad in this direction, right? So these are broader. It's right here where the soft tissue that are the tail flukes, those triangular things in their tail, stick onto the vertebral column, right there. And we have a similar shape change in Dorodon, and it suggests that these guys had tail flukes like modern Stenella. No other vertebral column undergoes shape changes like this except sea cows, which also have tail flukes. So we think this pattern is associated with flukes in basilsaurids. This is the pelvis of a related animal called Chrysocetus. We don't have one from Dorodon, but it's a similar animal. It's really teeny. It's about this big. And that's where the femur would articulate. And this is a femur. That is a kneecap. And the thing over here is actually an astragalus of Dorodon. So just tiny little, very reduced things. This whole animal is about 5 meters long. And this little pelvis here is probably 10 centimeters in Dorodon. So again, just to summarize, they have kind of short necks. Whales tend to have short necks that make their bodies more fusiform, flipper-like forelimb, more vertebrae. So they have this long torso, and that allows for muscle originations to then insert back here to move the tail up and down to move the flukes, which is how they swim. And of course, they have no sacrum anymore, no fused vertebrae, and the hind limb has completely detached from the vertebral column, although it was probably still external to the body wall, like it was outside the body. Whales today usually have one little stick of bone that's a remnant of the pelvis, maybe two if you're a baleen whale for pelvis and femur. Okay, now this map should look a little different to you now. So the things that are different are India is really connected to Asia now. There's no more water gap between India and Asia. And there is a water gap between South America and Antarctica and South America and Australia. So that at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary is a dramatic change in global climate and global ocean circulation. It allows the establishment of a circum-Antarctic current, which immediately causes glaciation in Antarctica. And we get a much steeper temperature gradient between the poles and the equator. So heat gets distributed on the planet really differently, and it makes productivity could still be high, but food becomes much more patchily distributed, we think, on the planet, which really shifts the feeding ecology of whales. And so what happens here is the basilsaurids basically go extinct, and we see the origins of Odontocetes and Mysticetes, the red dots and the blue dots. So far I've taken you through the transition, right, from terrestrial to aquatic. So basilsaurids are as aquatic as any modern cetacean. And now we're going to we have to follow two different paths, right? So we're going to follow the Mysticete path, then we'll come back and we'll follow the Odontocete path to get us to today. So there's this phenomenon that's out in the literature called cranial telescoping. And it's said to apply to whales, but there's really two kinds. There's one for toothed whales and one for Mysticete whales. So archaeocetes show the sort of normal relationships between the bones of the skull. They fit together like this, right? They butt up against one another. In Mysticetes, some of the bones that are in the back of the skull sort of push forward on top of other stuff that's more anterior. So it kind of pushes this way. And in Odontocetes, they do the opposite. They take bones that are here in the face and push them way up on top of the skull. And that effectively moves the nares from here to here, pushes it back. But the bones all lap on top of one another like a telescope. You know, a telescope collapses. And it's really dramatic in Odontocetes. It's less so in Mysticetes and comes from the other direction. So it's not one phenomenon, it's two different ones. But in both groups, the nares has moved really far back on the skull to help facilitate breathing when they surface. And we're going to follow the Mysticetes. So Mysticetes today feed in primarily three different ways. One, in A here, we got the skimmers. So things like right whales open their mouth and they swim around, and there's a gap between the left and right baleen plates. So water goes in and then flows out the sides and through the baleen, and the food gets trapped on the inside and they lick it off and eat it. Then we got the rorquals, which are gulpers, and they they have these throat grooves here. What they do is they see a blob of food and they run at it really fast with their mouth open, take a giant gulp of water, and that throat pouch expands, and then they contract it, pushing the water out through the baleen and trapping the food in the baleen plates. Then you got the crazy gray whales down here, which literally ram their heads into the bottom and suck water in along with sediment and stuff that's in the sediment. And then they push the water and sediment back out and they eat what was in the sediment. That's not the only way they feed, but it's one way that they feed. And it's quite unusual. And you actually see, if you fly a drone or helicopter over places they do this, you see these big gouges in the bottom where they actually have done this. And they're basically whale head shaped ditches in the sediment. Now, fossil mysticetes are quite different. And notice this graph is from 2010. It's now 2022. So I'm just going to warn you that this is an idea from then, and I'm going to update it for today. But it's an interesting place to start. So down here, we got the basilosaurid archaeocetes. Here are the toothed whales, the odontocete, but this is mainly about mysticetes. And up here, we got those feeding modes. We've got gulping, we got ram feeding, we got bottom feeding. And in fact, there are some fossil groups that appear to have adopted those feeding modalities too. But down here in yellow, we have toothed mysticetes, because remember, they came from toothed ancestors and they didn't just lose their teeth overnight. So we have things that are potentially mysticetes, and some that are almost certainly mysticetes that still have teeth and thus had some unusual feeding modes. And here is one thing that has been said to be an mysticete, and it has teeth that look to me an awful lot like basilosaurid archaeocetes. And even the skull looks rather like a basilosaurid archaeocete, with which it is compared here. Not exactly. There are some things about it which suggest something more advanced, but it's called Coronodon. It was described by my colleague Jonathan Geisler. It had a mouthful of these sort of, not quite triangular now, but a little more rounded cusps, but multi-cusp teeth with multiple roots. In their analysis, it came out as a mysticete. I think some new analyses being done by others, and one of my grad students, Nick Brand, are suggesting that maybe this isn't quite a mysticete, but maybe part of the stem group from which mysticetes and odontocetes are derived. We shall see. For now, it is still classified as a mysticete, but had really big teeth and no baleen. There's a group called the Mammalodontidae, which are small. That skull is like this big. It's very small. Big eyes, suggesting perhaps that they were visual predators, and a mouth full of, I don't know, sea lion-like teeth. Like just in overall form, this skull looks much more like a sea lion than a whale, much less a mysticete whale, but a mouthful of teeth. And we think it probably captured individual prey items like archaeocetes did, or like odontocetes did, and almost certainly did not chew them, probably ate them whole. But again, it's thought to be a mysticete. And then we got things like this, the Artiodacyls, which there's a bunch of taxa, which had these really tiny teeth, broadly spaced. My colleagues, Tom Demery and others from San Diego, have suggested that they had both teeth and a tiny fringe of proto-baleen. Currently, my lab and others are having a bit of a scientific debate with them about their evidence for such things. We aren't saying they didn't have this. We're saying that there's the evidence they have used to show that they have it is dubious. So, I mean, baleen had to come from somewhere at some time. It's just not crystal clear where and when. Their evidence is that Artiodacyls has these little holes or foramina, and in modern whales like Balanoptera, they have big foramina and these sort of channels which have blood vessels and nerves that feed the gums, that feed the baleen. And these guys have a couple of little teeny tiny ones. And we have shown in our most recent paper that basically every Every whale has them. Odontocetes have them, archaeodacyls have them, and artiodactyls have them on their palate. So that these foramina indeed could be feeding the baleen with nerves and blood vessels, but they don't indicate the presence of baleen, because in things that don't have baleen, they just feed the gums. And so we're having a rousing debate about that in the scientific literature right now. So stay tuned. This is an animal called Maya balena that's at Smithsonian, described by my student Carlos Paredo and I. And we described it as having no baleen and no teeth, because we couldn't identify the palatal foramina at all. And this is what got us on this. We don't think the palatal foramina mean anything. Now, I will give you this. The palate is not in the best of shape, right? It's a little crushed. But even if they're there, we don't think they mean anything. But that suggests an odd feeding mechanism, right? If you don't have teeth and you don't have baleen, how are you feeding? So this is just sort of a summary of tooth loss, right? Dorodon has big old teeth. Things like Mammaliodon and Gangecetus have smaller teeth, but they're closely packed. Edicetids have tiny little teeth, and things like Eumatocetus and Maya balena back there don't have any. And so the hypotheses of relationships of teeth and baleen and feeding are this, that those basilosauride-like teeth might be used like crab-eater seals use their teeth to filter krill from the water. This is probably the one hypothesis no one supports anymore. There's the medial baleen hypothesis, which is the one I showed you for Edicetids, where they have teeth and baleen on the inside the teeth. Another is they have it in the back of the jaw with teeth in front. And then there's the no baleen, no teeth, and that's the suction feeding hypothesis. So like gray whales do today, they sort of suck stuff into their mouth. We think that perhaps suction feeding is an intermediate between using teeth to feed and using baleen to feed. And baleen came after suction feeding. And one nice thing about the suction feeding hypothesis is, if you really think about it, every mammal can suck, because all mammals have to do it when they're babies, right? They have to be able to nurse, which means creating suction to draw the milk into the mouth. So if you just kept doing that as an adult, just fed on other things, there you go, suction feeding. So there was a whole lot of diversity of feeding modes at the base of mysticetes. And then all of a sudden, all that stuff goes away, and all we have are toothless mysticetes, which have other evidence of having had baleen. Now, we're going to switch gears. Sorry, I should go back here and say, now we're going to go over here and talk about what makes toothed whales, and that is echolocation, right? They make high-frequency sounds appear in their oropharynx. They have this very specialized blob of fat on their head called the melon, which is, again, a kind of acoustic fat. So sound goes out the melon and is actually shaped. The beam is shaped by muscles that move the fat. They can focus it or make it more broad. And then the echoes come back through the mandible into the fat pad, which touches the ear and sends the sound into the ear, which is tuned to high frequency sounds. So they have both the ability to make the sounds and to hear the sounds. And we can see that readily in the fossil record. And I'll just tell you now that even the most basal odontocetes have all the equipment to do both making and perceiving the sounds. And what's really interesting about that is some people have hypothesized that basically all mammals can echolocate. And if you've never seen this, there are children who've been born blind who learn how to human children who make click sounds and echolocate. They can actually navigate spaces they're unfamiliar with by making clicks and listening to the echoes. It's astonishing. Like, I'd never seen this. And then several years ago, I actually saw a story on it and did more investigation. It's pretty amazing how you would never think a human has the ability to echolocate based on the frequencies we can hear and the sounds we can make, but we can. So it may have started out like that, and it works better at high frequencies, but it works at sort of more normal frequencies too. So here's, I don't expect you to actually read this diagram. It's a family tree of odontocetes. So the yellow ones are the stem odontocetes, and everything up here are the ones that are still around today and their relatives. The most basal of modern ones are sperm whales. So there's sperm whales right there. These guys are the stemmy stem ones. And there's this family here, I will show you in a sec, called the Xenorophidae. They're the most basal branch of the odontocete tree. I named this guy Albertocetus. It is a xenoropid, and I named the family. And they're unusual. The lacrimal bone, the one that has your tear ducts in it, is really big in them, and a few other things make them unusual. But again, they had all the equipment to do echolocation, and they're all quite small. And the xenorophids are really strong in like the Carolinas. Like we have most if not all the specimens are from South Carolina. Cymacetidae is a related family, a little more crownward towards the modern guys from the Pacific coast. And this animal, Cymacetus, probably represents the oldest odontocete we have. And it's from Oregon. It's on the other side of the continent. This is Agarophius. This is a sort of a sad story. This is a plate from this guy, True. This is a really interesting fossil, and it's missing. It got lost somehow, except for this tooth. The tooth is still around. So it's not completely lost, but the skull itself is lost, but it too represents one of these stem groups. And my colleague Stephen Godfrey, who you guys may know from Calvert Marine Museum, if you've ever been there, describes some fossils that we attributed to Agarophius pygmaeus, this species. So we some people have advocated not talking about it anymore because it's lost, but the tooth isn't lost, and we attributed these fossils to the same species based on this really nice figure of it, and so kept this family alive and kicking. There is a family called the Squalodontidae, which you may have heard of, represented here by Squalodon. These are well represented in the Calvert Formation. This is Squalodon calvertensis, described by Remington Kellogg of the Smithsonian, represented by a bunch of specimens, lots of teeth. What's really interesting about this is it's got a rather advanced skull. Here's the nares way on top of the head, but it's got these really primitive looking teeth. They're not identical to basilsaurids, but they have lots of features of them. What's more advanced about it is they have more teeth, right? All odontocetes are, well, primitively polydont. They get more teeth than basilsaurids have. You can see that here in Wipodia from the Wipatiidae. There's lots of these double-rooted little Christmas tree-shaped teeth. This guy is from New Zealand, although we think members of this family are also represented elsewhere in the Mediterranean. So those are all stem groups of odontocetes. There's quite a diversity of them. And then at the Oligocene-Miocene boundary, we lose a lot of those. Just like with the mysticetes, we lose a lot of that early diversification, and they're replaced by representatives of modern family and genera. So that happens in both mysticetes and odontocetes. And you can see that really dramatically in this diagram. It just shows all the families and their ranges in time. So here the archaeocete, these are mysticetes, sorry, the archaeocetes are not here. So here are the early mysticetes, and they all peter out basically here at the Eocene, or at the Oligocene-Miocene boundary. Here, all the stemmiest of stem odontocetes, and then a few that make it from the Oligocene into the Miocene. And then by the middle Miocene, basically all the modern families of whales are around. And then we just very slowly lose some of these remaining stem groups. Now, as I said, we actually do have direct fossil evidence of baleen. And this you're looking at it right here. This is a skull up here of a baleen whale, and these platey things are baleen plates that have been permineralized. And this is from Balenopteroid, so like a modern rorqual from the late Miocene of Peru in the Pisco Formation. Really exquisite preservation. It's so well preserved, I could actually count the plates. There's 122 plates, which is in line with modern rorquals. So really, really, really amazing preservation. Probably because these animals died in an algal bloom of diatoms, which are little silica producing microorganisms, and got very rapidly buried, and that preserved the structure of the baleen. But even around here in the Calvert formation, we have things like Pilocetus here. If you look at the palate, remember how I said that modern balanopterids or balanopteroids had these foramina and grooves with blood vessels that fed the baleen? Well, there they are. There's no question that those are homologous, or they're evolutionarily the same structure as the ones we see in modern rorquals. And you got them right here in the Calvert Formation from the middle. Oops, that's not right. That should say Miocene, sorry. Of the middle Miocene in the Calvert Formation. This is Parabalanoptera from it's not San Diego Formation, but it's from the Miocene of California, which isn't a modern genus, but it really looks like a modern rorqual. So by the Miocene, we got basically very modern looking whale faunas globally, basically. There is a weird group. There's this thing called Caperia, the pygmy right whale, which is in the family Neobalenidae, and they have a terrible fossil record. They're only known from the southern hemisphere, and this is like one of two fossils of other things from the family. This one is also from Peru, and it looks really, really like a modern Caperia. So it's not the same genus, but they're very, very similar. So again, by the Miocene, pretty modern looking things. And these are the three modern, well, there's actually four modern families, but the gray whale is basically part of this balanopteroid radiation, the rorquals, and we got the right whales up here in Balena, and pygmy right whale in Caperia. And what's amazing to me, and this is something I'm studying, is body size evolution. The largest animal ever to live is the blue whale, and they're around today. Not a dinosaur, it's not some giant Indricotherium or something like that. It's a whale, and it's a living whale. So just think about that for a little bit. In the Odontocetes, in the Miocene, we had things like Kentriodons here. This is Kentriodon, which is also from the Calvert Formation. And it's, for all intents and purposes, a modern dolphin. It's not got any of the special features of modern dolphins or porpoises or like belugas or anything, but it is, we think, ancestral to all the sort of modern dolphin groups in the Delphinoidea. And there were radiations of things that were really common and are completely gone, like the Uhrina again from the Calvert Formation, where they're characterized by having a really long snout. In fact, so long it goes out beyond the tip of their jaw, with hundreds and hundreds of needle-like teeth. These guys were abundant and they were everywhere, and then they were gone. And it could be that they were actually outcompeted by more derived delphinoids, but it's just an idea. We don't really know that for sure. All we know is they were abundant and widespread, and now they're just extinct. Again, here's a weirdo from a modern group. This is a fossil dolphin. The Phocinidae are dolphins, and this had sort of the opposite condition of Uhrina. Instead of the snout being really long, it's their lower jaw that was much longer than the snout, called semi-rostrum or half rostrum. And my colleague Rachel Rassicos suggested they were probing the bottom for prey with that sort of extended chin, if you will, of their rostrum, but an unusual representative of a modern family. This is another,
one more question, Mark, if I may. Speaking of modern, are there any whales today that eat mostly microorganisms? This came in on the chat.
Easy one. No. None. Yep. I mean, even, the smallest things I think they eat is a lot of right whales eat copepods, and they're pretty small, but not really microscopic. Yep. Nope.
Appreciate it.
No problem. So monodontids are belugas and narwhals today. We have a decent fossil record of them at lower latitudes. Today, they're Arctic or subarctic in distribution, but this is from North Carolina. There are some from Mexico and Southern California. This is Bohaskaya. If any of you know Dave Bohaska at Smithsonian, it's named after him. Nice fossil there. And these are the modern odontocetes. As I said, the physoterids, the sperm whales and pygmy sperm whales are the most basal branch of modern sperm whales or of modern odontocetes. And we got a lot of these, like Platanista is the Ganges River dolphin, and it's a representative of a much larger distribution that was really abundant in the Miocene, but we still have that one relic species. And then the dolphin, or the Ziphiids are beaked whales, and then all the rest are part of this delphinoid or dolphiny radiation. Excuse me, just a few sort of big picture things, and I'll wrap it up here. So this is part of a study I did and I'm still doing on diversity, like how many whales were there and why there were so many at different times. So you can see they sort of peak in the middle Eocene, drop towards the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, where that's where we get rid of Archaeocetes, and we pick up the Neoceti, and then they just go crazy up to the middle Miocene, and then plunge towards the recent. And with one little gap, see how there's like this weird gap here? It doesn't go smoothly down. There's an explanation for that gap that makes a lot of geologic sense. In the Mycenaean, a really crazy thing happened in that there was cooling and drying across the planet. But in addition to that, the Mediterranean dried up, like it closed off and it became isolated and basically dried up. And guess what? A lot of our whale localities here and here are from the Mediterranean. So no Mediterranean, no whales. And so very obvious explanation for that. But really want to know, like, why there's so many whales here and maybe not so many over here. And my colleague, Nick Peinson, and I from Smithsonian, he wasn't at Smithsonian at the time, did this study in North America that showed that basically one thing that has plagued diversity studies before is that they tend to correlate with the amount of rocks available to find fossils in. So we did this thing where we showed this is showing like a sort of scatter shot of points. That's a good thing because it shows there's no correlation between diversity and rock area. We actually measured all the rock area and like, nope, none there. And my colleague Felix Marx did it in Europe and did a different kind of analysis, but showed the same thing, that it was not because of the rocks. Whatever was going on, there was actually a story to tell that wasn't just the rocks. And so Felix and I got together and said, well, what hypothesis is there? And one, we decided a lot of their evolution is controlled by feeding, and most things about diversity, if you think about it, have to do with like temperature. Is it warm? Is it cool? Is it fair to Midland? And so we decided to explore that. And, baleen whales do mass feeding, and they go and take big gulps of water at once. But even odontocetes tend to collect where there's a bunch of squid or a bunch of fish, right? So they eat one at a time, but they tend to feed on these mass assemblages of food. So we're like, well, maybe mass feeding has something to do with it. And, paleooceanography and temperature might affect how those food resources are distributed on the planet. So this is just an example of food webs. Primary producers in the ocean in the Cenozoic are diatoms, those little silica-producing photosynthetic organisms, which are then eaten by things like copepods, krill. They get up into fish and squid, and then they get eaten by things higher up in the food chain. So we looked at all of the Oligocene to Pleistocene cetaceans. This is the data set we use from all over the world. And then we checked to see whether diversity was correlated with any of these things or any combination of those things. We looked at diatoms, the number of fossil formations, again, to sort of factor out rock area. Delta O18 is a measure of ocean temperature, and nanofossils are sort of a sanity check. They're another kind of microfossil that we don't think is supporting the base of the food chain. So what we found out was that temperature in the form of O18 and diatom diversity, which is our measure of primary productivity in the ocean, a model that combined those two really predicted diversity really well. So it predicted the diversity of both mysticetes and odontocetes and them together. So here they are together, here they are apart. And like I said, the model included both diatoms and delta O18, which matched our prediction that productivity and temperature would really drive how many different kinds of whales there were. And this is just a sort of goodbye slide to say, you know, from our friend Carl Buell, who did a bunch of illustrations of whales just before we wrote our book, and this book that I wrote, Cetacean Paleodiversity or Paleobiology, he did a few illustrations for us too. And it's all about the feeding, right? So it's all about what you eat, where you eat, and how you acquire your prey. And so I just want to say thank you very much. And if you have any more questions, I'm very happy to sit here for a while and answer questions for you.
That was super interesting, Mark. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
Questions?
Don't be shy.
So many questions, we don't know where to start. So at one point you mentioned, and I'm only half remembering this, that the two different branches of whales both had the modification to their nasal structure, but they happened independently. Was that like an example of convergent evolution, or was it, or did they start from a common ancestor that had begun this process? Do you know what I'm asking? I'm not expressing myself well. Okay.
Nope, that's okay. I'm going back to that slide. So the common ancestor is A. So it had none of this telescoping. So they both did it, but I almost want to kill that idea that there is a thing called telescoping. There's not.
Okay.
There's what odontocetes do, and there's what mysticetes do. And both have the effect of getting the nares higher on the skull, but you can see it's much higher on the skull in an odontocete than it is in a mysticete. And the rearrangement of bones is completely different. Yep.
Got it.
So
I think a couple questions came in on the chat here. Let's see.
Yep.
What was the odd feeding mode you mentioned?
Yes, I did not have a picture of this one. There's this animal called Odobena-cetops. It means the walrus whale, and in fact, the skull looks like that of a walrus. It's got tusks that go down like a walrus. It's got a short face. It is a monodontid, so it's one of these guys. I thought I had a picture of it. I had added one to my monodontid slide, but I didn't. So let me get there. Like narwhals, right? So, but they have two tusks and they go down like a walrus, and they're thought to have perhaps lost the ability to echolocate, and were thought to be bottom feeders, bottom suction feeders, like walruses. Yep. So not fish and squid, but probably eating things like clams.
Got it.
Yep.
Let's see. Couple other questions here. Were any migrations in the proto whales found?
No, I say that very reluctantly because I'd sure love to demonstrate this. It's hard. I'm not sure how you would do it. I mean, I have some ideas, like some sperm whales, like, let me back up. Odontocetes grow their teeth continuously through life. So you get tooth bands, like bands of growth, like tree rings in their teeth. So maybe if we could microscopically sample those teeth, we might be able to see like geochemical tracers of living in one ocean versus another ocean. We've almost done that. Like we've shown you can slice them open and age them, but we've not quite taken that last step to do the microsampling. And I'm not sure, even if we can, whether it would show us anything, even if they were migrating, because water's water, right? So ocean chemistry does vary from place to place, but it would have to be pretty dramatically different for us to detect it. I still want to try, but I don't think we're ever going to really know. Almost certainly some of these guys are, some of the modern whales are migrating, the neocetes. We don't have any evidence of migration in archaeocetes.
Cool. And that kind of segues into one of the two remaining questions. Where do you see gaps in the record?
The biggest one is a doozy. So, well, actually two. So remember I said that the earliest odontocetes are clearly echolocating. We don't, I'd like a few more things between the basilsaurids and odontocetes. It's too big of a gap. I mean, their teeth look similar, but I'd like to see some more in that gap. Also, very interestingly, there appears to be very few fossils, and there are no named genera of mysticetes in the earliest Miocene. So that's another time when the fossil record just isn't producing as much as we would like. But there's not this sort of morphological gap there. Like, it's pretty smooth. Yep.
Got it. One last thing, and then I think people are starting to exit, so we're probably going to wrap this up. Are there other animals that use baleen to feed? Maybe rays?
Nope.
Nope.
None.
Only whales.
No, I mean, there's other things that filter feed, but they all do it differently. Like, basking sharks use their gills.
Right.
So there's this sort of convergent thing going on, but baleen is a unique structure to baleen whales. Yep.
Oh, one more question. All right. Can you distinguish in fossils between fresh and salt water?
Yes, we can. Some of the very earliest whales, like Pakicetus, is known from estuarine deposits. So, where salt water and fresh are mixing, there are a couple, like a handful of freshwater fossils, but it's not clear whether they're like freshwater whales, or even today, like some can get up into freshwater. Interestingly enough, the Ganges River dolphin, like I said, is this Platanista, is this representative of a much larger clade from the past. We have lots of fossils of Platanistids, but zero of Platanista. And I think, if we actually went and looked in Pliocene river deposits that were formed by the Proto-Ganges, we might be able to find some. And we would know, because that's far enough from the ocean that we could be pretty confident that it's freshwater today. Freshwater interpretation of the habitat is probably freshwater.
One more. They keep coming. If you don't mind.
That's all right.
Can you correlate cetacean evolution to shark evolution?
In what sense?
Adrian, what did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, we can sort of map both, but I'm not sure there's something more to it than that.
So, just as a for instance, I mean, a popular one would be the megalodons that got huge.
Yep.
And then died out.
Yeah. Actually, I've written about this with my shark friends. So there was this idea that megalodon was eating. So there's this group of baleen whales from the time megalodon was around in the Miocene. They're small, and that maybe megalodon was eating them, and that's why baleen whales got big. And it just doesn't work out. Like we've done that sort of correlation, and it just doesn't work out as a cause for megalodon to go extinct, much less megalodon being a driver of bigness in baleen whales. And there's also, at the same time, a radiation. So sperm whales today are really, really specialized to be deep divers that eat giant squid. But back then, they were macroraptorial. They were really big with giant teeth, and they too are thought to maybe feed on these small whales. They too went extinct, right? So, it's really hard. We can map it all out, but at least for the sharks, the timing isn't right for megalodon extinction, much less baleen whales getting big. We haven't really done that for the sperm whales, but I don't think it's going to work with them either.
And then lastly, can you tell if they slept?
I can't tell, but I can assure you they did, because that's like a feature of
all mammals need to sleep.
All of them, yeah. And And you can go Google like dolphin sleep now. They do hemispheric sleeping.
Right, I've read about this.
Yeah, and they turn off half their brain sleeps, so the other half stays awake, which is
Because they still have
fascinating.
to rise and breathe and submerge and move around.
Yep, yep. And they basically take little half brain cat naps all the time. Not all the time, but when they do. And I would love to have some indicator of when that evolved, but and basically they had to figure something out as soon as they became aquatic, right? If you can't come out on land, you have to sleep. So somehow in there they had to have some method of doing it. Whether it was what they do now, we can't tell.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you, Mark. That was really fascinating, and a lot of other supportive messages in the chat thanking you. Really appreciate your expertise and your time.
You are welcome.
All right.
It was fun.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Happy holidays, everyone. We'll see you in 2023. Take care.
Take care all. Bye now.